really well developed. And even in this, I just walking morning in Jerusalem. So just such a warm, lovely feeling. It's really and it was more advanced. So today we're going to be, I'll take it off in a minute, but today we're going to be looking at how Jesus dealt with some tricky and difficult human problems. And before we start with the difficult bit, we're going to have a reading which Stuart's going to bring us about what he thought his purpose in coming was. And today we'll be kind of making reference to a lot of stories that you know really well, so we're not going to read them all, but we're just going to read this passage and refer to various other things that I think you'll be able to put together and remember. So can we have the next one? And this is the time when Jesus went to the synagogue in Nazareth. Thanks.
And this is Luke chapter 4, reading from verse 16. Jesus went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." Then he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing."
Thank you. I was really, really glad when Neil said this morning these songs are about joy. Because I thought, so often we look at the problem. Guess what? All around us there's problems, and on the surface, all of you look like you've got no problems at all. Lovely, wonderful, happy people. But if I spent much longer with you, you'd find out that I have some problems, and I'd find out that you have some problems. That's just life, isn't it? And then you go out there and you're confronted with all kinds of other people. And guess what? You'll also find that there's mixed in with the good stuff, there's also problems. So I wanted to start with this affirmation of what Jesus thought he'd come for. He didn't actually say, "I've come to get bogged down in all of the sin of the world." He said he came with a mission, didn't he? And that mission, he described it several ways, apart from reading from the prophet Isaiah in that passage. He also said, "I've come to bring," what did he come to bring? Life. And he also went on to say, it's not just ordinary life, but abundant life. So basically he's on about joy, isn't he? So Jesus said this is the aim of his exercise. He also talked about bringing people into the kingdom of God, the place where God is the king. And when God is the king, guess what? There's order, and there's good life, there's joy, there's wholesomeness, and a lot of other good stuff that I haven't mentioned, and we could probably go on for a long time. So Jesus' mission was not to get bogged down in problems, which I tend to do, that's one of my weaknesses, but to go beyond that and lead people out to something better. But as he went around, he did find problems, or problems found him. More usually, problems confronted him. People brought people with problems to him, or the people with problems screamed out to him or came and begged him for help or whatever. So we're going to look at 4 major areas in which Jesus this is his ministry, dealt with different kinds of problems. They're common problems. They still happen to be around today, but this just looks at what Jesus did. Now, these 4 problems are, in the order in which we see them in the Gospels: sickness, then demons, then wrong thinking, then sin. Now, I think if I was going to order them according to the way we think of them, I'd probably be doing a backwards order, pretty much. But this is how people came to see what he was dealing with, and people tended to see him dealing with sickness and demons before they got around to realising that he also could deal with wrong thinking and something as fundamental as sin. Next one. So we're going to look at some of these. Now, I know it's a little bit faint because we don't have a choice here with light and things, but a lot of these stories you know, the Bible stories. You won't know the story I'm going to tell you about Emmaus in Ethiopia. But starting up here, these are some of the stories. The first one is about Peter's mother, who was sick with a fever. How did Jesus deal with that problem of sickness? He simply helped her up. He took her hand and helped her up. It's not a very dramatic way to heal people, is it? Except it says, the fever left her. Now, wouldn't that be great to have Jesus around and he could just take you by the hand and gently lift you up, and that's it. Like no drama. Nothing else. The fever just went. The next one, the guy came with leprosy and he begged Jesus to heal him. And Jesus did something that nobody would have done in those days because it was actually against the law. He touched him. Right, now we needn't have. We've just seen, from some of the other stories, I mean, Jesus could have just said, oh, I'm not going to touch you, just be healed. But no, he actually broke the law. That's the only time that Jesus broke the law, I might say. People think he broke the law. The Pharisees thought he broke the law by healing on the Sabbath, but there was nothing in the law that says you can't heal on the Sabbath. In fact, the law said if your animal is donkey's stuck in the pit, then you get them out. Same thing Jesus said. If you can do that for animals, why can't you do that for people? Right, so he's taking a different tactic each time, you'll notice. And then the next one was the guy that came through the roof. And Jesus looked at the faith of the friends. And you think, well, what's that got to do with it? Well, I'm just telling you what the Bible says. And Jesus forgave his sin. Now, where did it mention sin? Anyway, and then the next thing you know is the guy's healed. Well, that was different again, wasn't it? The next one, somebody had a shriveled hand. Well, what's Jesus going to do with this one? He simply tells the guy, stretch out your hand. In other words, the very thing that he can't do. And so the guy had to, I wonder what it would have been like. I mean, I can remember a time actually when, this is years ago, when our kids were quite small and I had injured my back and I couldn't move and I couldn't get up out of the chair or out of the bed or out of anything. And so Stuart got the kids around and they prayed for me. And then I thought that was lovely. That was really nice until Stuart said, get up. Excuse me, that's the very thing I can't do. And then I thought, okay, I've got to try. And guess what? In the trying, I could. And that's how the healing happened. And so that's the tactic that Jesus took. So I don't know whether, Stuart, you were trying to copy Jesus in that one, were you? Or I don't know what was going on, but anyway, it worked. And then you've got the woman with all of the bleeding for 12 years or however many years it was, she touched the hem of his garment. Now, Jesus didn't even approach her. She was just doing that thinking, no one will see me. Jesus won't know. I'll just go and look, I don't want to cause a fuss. She's a woman after all, and people are not really wanting to have her around. But Jesus knows. He says, who touched me? And that woman's faith was involved in her healing. The next one was a dead girl. And this goes another step further because he says to her, get up. Now, if you're dead, that's one thing you can't do. But she did. Jesus took her hand, so he would have helped her. So here is Jesus doing things that for other people are impossible. And the blind man, what did he do? He spit. It was at the time when he put the clay on as well. But anyway, he got some spit anyway. That was in the story I read. And put her on the guy's eyes. Now, where does it say in the Bible to do that? Goodness me, that's not a terribly hygienic thing to do, is it? Especially not in COVID season. But then Jesus was fine with germs, so, it's all right. Anyway, the point is, the man could see again. And then the last one, this is a really interesting one in John chapter 5. Remember the guy by the pool? And he was waiting they believed that the angel stirred the waters, and if you got in at the right time, you get healed. And of course, the problem was he couldn't walk, and he needed somebody else to put him in, and he never got there in time. And Jesus came along, and he asked him an interesting question. Does anyone remember what it was? What was it? Can't hear you. Do you want to be healed? Now, isn't that an interesting question? You might think, well, why did he do that? Why didn't he just go, like that and heal him? Because actually Jesus knew that if this guy has been like this since he was very young, which he had been, that means he wouldn't have learned a trade. That means he wouldn't have worked. That means he wouldn't have had to take the normal responsibilities in society. You can see where I'm driving it? Now, do you actually want to give up your sickness? Because if you stay sick, guess what? You can get lots of sympathy. And I know people in Ethiopia as whom it's actually much more economical to stay a beggar than it is to get healed. Seriously, it is financially, you're better off. And today, disability pension, all that kind of stuff. So the begging is the equivalent of disability pension back then. And so Jesus was serious. He knew this was actually going to be a tough issue. It was only when he got that yes answer that he didn't put him in the pool, he just healed him. That's it. He just said, well, pick up your mat now and walk. Well, if you're paralysed, you wouldn't have been able to do that either. So, but there would have been, with that healing, there would have had to have been quite a rehabilitation process, because if you're going to get suddenly healed, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to go to school, aren't you? Or the equivalent? Or you're going to go and find someone to learn from how to do something to make a living. His life was going to be dramatically changed. Jesus did the miraculous part, but from this point on, this man was going to have to take a lot of steps to change his life. Rehabilitation is what we call it today. Now, people come to Christ out of different reasons, so I've got with each of these four characters one little story about someone I know and care about. And this one's a guy called Emmaus in Ethiopia. I'm sorry you can't see his face all that well. I took that photo of him 10 years ago when we were in Ethiopia. It's scary to think it's a whole 10 years since then. We were there for a year. But I asked Emmaus, how did you become a Christian? He was teaching at the same college I was. So that's it, where he ended up, still there. And he said, I've got to start by telling you a bit about my parents. He said, my dad was a bush ranger. Right, great place to start, isn't it? He said he had a gun and he used to, hold like a highwayman. He'd hold up people who were going on the highway and to get money. That's how he got his money. So he'd do that, and then of course the gun went off, and I'm sure there were a few people who no longer were living after they started on that journey. So he said, that was my dad. And then he decided when he was about 42 that he thought it was about time he should get married. But you see, most of the girls of marriageable age were 12. He thought that was a little bit too young to take a wife who was 12. This is in southern Ethiopia, back in the days. Emmaus is a few years younger than us. So he said, I need a wife who's a bit older than that. So he thought, all the women who are the right age, they're already married. He wasn't going to let that worry him, of course. He thought, I better not take a first wife. Perhaps I could take a second, third or fourth wife. Because then, if the husband just misses one wife, that's not quite so bad, is it? So he kind of looked around and he picked out a lady. She was a second wife and she had 2 kids. Now, this man didn't want the kids. He was not interested in that. So he thought he needed to get this woman, and so the only way he got anything was with a gun. And so he lined her up when she was coming on the highway with someone, and he got the gun out and basically at gunpoint carted her off, and, if she didn't go with him, she'd be dead. So that's how he got her as his wife, And I don't know what happened in terms of a legal marriage or anything, any of those niceties. But anyway, in due course, so it wasn't what you call a love marriage. And she, suddenly been ripped away from her 2 kids. And so then she got pregnant, and there was a boy born, and he got very sick when he was 6 months old, and then he died. And the witch doctor at the time said, well, you didn't sacrifice enough chickens. So, you need to do more of that. And he said, you're going to have 3 sons, but they're all going to die of the same problem. So anyway, the next year she got pregnant with a second son, and same thing at 6 months. When his son was 6 months, he got the same sickness, and he was on his way to death. And so they were busy trying to scrounge chickens and things, to take to the witch doctor. And anyway, then somebody came in, the neighbour came in and said, wait. We've just heard about somebody who can heal. His name's Jesus. And he doesn't need any chickens at all. Well, the parents thought this was a much better deal. So they said, but you've got to wait till the morning, and then we're going to get this guy to come and he'll tell you about Jesus, because we don't know very much. All we know is just what we heard this afternoon. And they said, but all we know that you have to do is get rid of the idols in your house. They said, that's all we know. We don't know anything else yet. We don't know much about this Jesus, but, do that. So they were desperate. So they got rid of the idols in their house. And then the next morning, this evangelist came from another village, and he led them to Jesus. And and the baby, who was Emmaus, lived. That from the time they came, and from the moment that his parents committed their lives to Christ, with very little knowledge, as you can imagine, the baby recovered. Now that's Emmaus. He's now got a doctorate. He now teaches mission subjects and goes around Ethiopia. Wonderful, wonderful Christian, godly man. And so he's been educated, gone to America and all kinds of things. And guess what? Those his parents, with that kind of beginning, started the first church in their house. And guess what? They grew to love each other. And they asked the first husband of her first husband if they could please have those 2 children back. And he was very glad to get rid of them. You know, that's 2 less mouths to feed. And so they came and they joined the family, and there was a 3rd son born, but he lived too. The rich doctor's predictions had all been broken, and he's a Christian man too. And that church is still going strong, and his parents are the leaders, and he said they are the most warm, happily married parents with lots and lots of other people coming and sharing their home. Now that's amazing. That all comes out of the need for sickness to be healed. And of course Jesus did a whole lot more than that. Next one. Second problem is demons. Now, I think today in Australia we either ignore the fact that, you know, the Bible inconveniently talks about demons and we say, well, they're, you know, today we'd call them other things, or we go to the other extreme and where we're looking for demons under every place possible. And we tend to go from one to the other because we're not really used to, in our culture, people talking about them. So we tend to go to extremes. And we can flip back and forth quite easily. And let's just look at some of these. In Mark chapter 1, and this is typical of many, many times in Matthew and Mark, where there's a little summary statement of what Jesus has been up to. And it says, he healed, that people brought to him the sick and the demon-possessed. And Jesus healed them, and he cast out the demons. Okay, that summary statement occurs many times. And you think, this is the obvious category for people in Jesus' community. And in Ethiopia, I must say that demons are obvious, and they're like, everybody knows about demons. It's just everyday thing. We have students come into class late because, you know, well, on the way they had to cast out a demon and all this kind of stuff. But then the colleges got strict and said, no, class is on at a certain time, you turn up here, and that's it. And so that they learnt that, you know, there's a place for dealing with demons, but it's not class time. You know, Jesus does things with a sense of order. That's one of the things I find remarkable in all of this, because a lot of what the demons are like is they make disorder. Jesus is about order, and he brings a sense of calmness, right timeness, and so he doesn't create chaos. In fact, he wants to eliminate chaos. So here's a few verses. So there's this guy screaming out in Mark 1, that was in the synagogue on this occasion, and Jesus simply commanded him, and he just said, be quiet, come out of him. Now, he might have said it a bit louder than that, but I don't think he screamed. It doesn't actually say how loud he spoke. And it happened. So Jesus tended to minimise the drama as far as possible, but with great effectiveness, because he carried the authority. He carried the absolute authority over every evil creature, as well as every human creature and every other creature. Then on another occasion in Mark 5, Jesus did also say, come out, but he also asked for the name. And in that case, there was a legion of demons, so there was a whole stack of them. So sometimes Jesus was interested in asking the name, whether it was for the sake of the people around him or not, it may have been. And sometimes he didn't, or at least it's not recorded that he did. Then we've got another couple of interesting ones where the parents are involved. There's a woman, and she's a Gentile woman, who comes to him and says, look, my daughter's got an evil spirit, and she's not even here. She's somewhere else, you know. And so Jesus saw that the mother had faith. The mother was coming to him, searching and with faith, wanting something to be done because her daughter was in great distress because of this evil spirit. I mean, that's a common thing, I think, that there's a lot of distress with people. That's why their friends and neighbours know they've got an evil spirit. I mean, there are lots of signs. But in Ethiopia, they can tell you. I mean, that's not here. People will say, well, how do you know if somebody's got an evil spirit? Ethiopia, they never ever ask that question. They just know it's just part of life. And so Jesus was able to say, the demon is gone. He didn't do any dramatic casting out or anything. He just said, it was, I've seen your faith. You can go. The demon is gone. Like, don't worry about it anymore. It's done. Quietly. So then the next one was when the father the boy was a deaf and dumb spirit, wasn't it, on that occasion? And the father said, Jesus wanted to know, and they said, you need faith. And the father said, well, I do believe, but help my unbelief. So, like he was saying, this is the best I can muster. I can do a little bit. I sort of believe. I want to believe. Help me to believe more strongly. And Jesus said, that's good enough. And the boy got healed. Just like that. Boy got healed. So, again, you see that Jesus seems to be quite creative, and he seems to match the way he does things with the situation. There's a flexibility there in how he responds to people. People are not just a problem, but they are a whole person. There's a whole situation. There's a whole family. And, we had that Gentile woman, we've got Jewish people. Some of them are more believers than others. Some of them might have pretty shaky beliefs themselves, but somebody in their family's got faith, or their friends have got faith, lowering the guy through the roof. And Jesus changes his methods according to the specific people and situations that he's dealing with. And that shows wisdom, and it shows compassion. He's not out to shame people. He's not out to create chaos. He's not out to over-dramatise anything. He's out to do what he came to do, bring that abundant life, and to show his power, yes, above that, and draw people to live into God's kingdom. Now, here is our friend Worku in Ethiopia. His name means gold, and because we had to learn the language when we were there for that year. And so I asked Worku. He's a church leader and lots of things, and also lectures in Islamic studies and various things. He's now currently running a mission. And so I said to Worku, how did you become a Christian? Oh, he said, because my brother had a demon. Okay, right. I mean, when I talk to people in Australia, most people don't say I became a Christian because my brother had a demon, do they? It's not usually the first thing that comes to mind, but this is Ethiopia. And I said, all right, tell me more. And he said, my parents went round to everybody. His father was a Muslim, and his mother was a nominal Ethiopian Orthodox, which is the kind of state church. And they went to everywhere that they could think of, the Orthodox Church, the Muslims, and they even went to doctors, even though they knew it was a demon. They went to everybody. Nobody could do anything. And then they finally met what we'd call a genuine Christian. Somehow or other, they met this person who said, "Well, would you mind if we just pray for him?" And they thought, they're desperate enough. So they went to meet this guy. It was a Friday night, if I remember rightly. And so they had one session praying with him. and the brother, was completely healed. That was the end of the demon possession. And for people in Ethiopia, it's very, very obvious if you have a demon or if you don't have a demon. Because it affects your behaviour, everything, so much. And at work, he said, I'd never seen power like that before. I said, people can talk and have good ideas and all that kind of thing, but power? And he said, I'd never seen anyone with that sort of power, so he became a believer himself and has continued to be, and is still leading people to Christ, a very effective preacher and teacher and organiser, and so there's Worku. Let's go to the third category of the way that Jesus dealt with difficulties. Wrong thinking, wrong teaching. Do we all have perfect thinking, teaching? No. That's something we kind of aim for, but, we're not there yet. And, Jesus must have been surrounded by all these problems all of the time. How many people in Jesus' company would have had wrong thinking, wrong teaching? It was there all the time, wasn't it? And most of the time he didn't say anything until there was a need. This is what I seem to see with Jesus all the time, that he waits for the right time when something becomes obvious that there needs to be some attention given to it. He's not walking around the whole day thinking, oh, has Pat got some wrong thinking here, Marion? I don't know. She might have some sin in her life, or Jesus doesn't do anything like that. He gets on with his life. He's very positive about his life. He's helping people. He's feeding the 5,000. He's calming the storm. He's doing all kinds of things to help people, to teach people, bring them closer to God. But what does he do? Here's just a few examples. I could go on and on and on with this, but a few examples here. Matthew 5. He said, you've heard that people teach that love your neighbour, but hate your enemy. He said, I say to you, something new, something different. That needs to be modified. Because if you just love your neighbour, how are you going to define as your neighbour? You can get tribalism. I only like people in my own tribe. I only like people in my own family. I only like people who live in my own town or who went to the same school, or who knows, Jesus said, no, we're not doing tribalism. I'm telling you, love your enemies and pray for those who use you, who persecute you. Now, that is definitely different teaching and definitely goes against the grain in lots of ways, but ends up being much more healthy. Now, the next one, Jesus says, and this is about being careful with, washing your plates and your cups and everything. Now, we do that for hygiene reasons, but Jesus said, be careful about teaching that just comes out of human tradition. That's not going to get you anywhere. Well, it might get you somewhere. Some of the rules that my mother taught me were sensible and good and right, about healthy ways to live. Yeah, they do get you somewhere, but they're not going to get you to God. If you're going to use the human teachings as a way to get you to God, they're going to fail. So we had to correct people and say, no, that's not what you listen to. And then lots and lots of times the Pharisees would come to him with trick questions, didn't they? They wanted to catch him. They wanted to pull him down. They wanted to put him in the pit. But guess what? Jesus was smarter. Now, I wish I had a bit more of that kind of smartness, and I'm not quick thinking enough when people say things that really are meant to trick me, and I would like to have a little bit more of that. But anyway, we've all got deficiencies and we're not Jesus. But sometimes he'd answer a question with a question. If the person was genuine, it's really interesting. If a person is genuine, with a genuine question, Jesus never ever humiliated them, never embarrassed them, never said anything in public to shame them. You remember even the woman caught in adultery. He waited till the accusers went away. Then he had his word to her and said, go and sin no more. That's all he said. But it was enough. That would have stayed with her. That would have pierced right through, wouldn't it? Then there's another time in Mark 12 where Jesus wasn't gentle. As I said, if a person is genuine with their question or their need, Jesus was very compassionate and very gentle. But here with these Sadducees, when they're going on trying to trick Jesus again, he just said to them straight, you don't know the scriptures or the power of God. Now that's pretty direct. I didn't put here the example of him, overturning the money changers in the temple. But that was pretty direct action as well, wasn't it? Trying to make the point that the way they were perceiving God and his temple and everything was, we'd say, up the creek. It was totally screwed up, was wrong. So he could be gentle, or he could be very strong and direct, and to make clear what the wrong way was, in order to make clear what the right way was. Then the disciples, didn't they? Remember them coming up and they said, Jesus, we want to come and sit next to you on your, I'll let me have the right seat and I'll let my brother have the left seat. And, well, the other disciples, they can get scattered around. They wanted to know who's the greatest. Well, Jesus made short shrift of that. And what he did was take a little child and say, you won't get into the kingdom of God unless you become like a child. That's the way it's recorded in Mark 9. But you see, Jesus dealt with people differently. With the disciples, he could have a close word with people he knew well, and then he was fairly strong. He was fairly straight because he knew they knew him. They also knew that they knew he loved them. They knew he cared about them. Whereas some of these other people out there didn't have that opportunity to have that understanding, so he was a bit more careful with what he would say to them in public. My third illustration is this man here, Gung. He's a good friend too. Gung is from China, and he came to our church. I was a minister for a church in Cambridge, England, just over 10 years ago. And Gung and his wife Emily came to our church, and they had no children at that stage. And I was talking to Gung, and I asked him, because he was from China, so I knew this was an appropriate question for someone from China. It's not appropriate maybe for someone from Australia. But knowing he came from China, I said, "Are you a Christian?" He said, "No." So I said, I thought, well, he came to church, there must be some reason. I said, well, are you interested in learning more about Christianity? He said, yes, I'd like to. So I said, all right, Friday night. So I went to his place Friday night, their place Friday night for the next 3 years. And in that process, we discussed things at a thinking level. Gung is a physicist. He's a very bright boy. And his wife's a mathematician. She's also very bright. And Gung has read the Chinese philosophers inside out and back to front. And so I suggested that we read Mark's Gospel. You might think, well, maybe that's not bright enough for a Chinese guy of that calibre. Well, he was amazed at the wisdom of Jesus, absolutely amazed. And he was comparing it with Chinese proverbs. So I learned in that period an awful lot about Chinese proverbs and Chinese philosophies and things, and I wish I had them taped, and I wish I could remember it all. But we had all these most interesting conversations, and he, of course, he had not even considered that there could be a God. So the idea of God was still very far out there, you know, because he'd been trained under the communist system, and where he was taught there was no God. So we had to start from a different place from where you'd start with a lot of other people. And but when he read Mark's Gospel, do you know what? He thought this book was so precious. He used to take his Bible, because we'd given him one. He'd bought one, I think, at this stage, which had English and Chinese. And he took it to work, to the physics lab in Cambridge. He took it to work, and he was very careful. You don't put it on the floor, you don't do anything like that. And because this is such a wise book. And so therefore he took it to read at lunchtimes and to gain some of the wisdom. And he kept on saying Jesus is such a wise teacher. So that's the entry point for him, was in correcting wrong thinking. Wrong thinking that there couldn't be a God, correcting wrong thinking that only the Chinese philosophers and the Chinese proverbs and all of that would come up with anything decent, and that there was actually somebody who was wiser than what he'd known. And so he was treasuring this. And then, of course, we got to the crucifixion, and he couldn't understand it. And he was really struggling with this. Well, you know, why would a good man be killed and all of that? Which we get there is sometimes a little bit different, as we've seen. And the story I just want to put quickly here on the right is my grandmother. Now, Grandma was married young to a man 20 years older than her. It's kind of semi-arranged. They come on the boat out from England, and her mother wanted my grandmother, who was the older daughter, to be married off as quickly as possible. You know, I mean, what are you going to do if you bring two teenage daughters out to Australia? Where are you going to fund everybody? And there was an eligible bachelor on the boat, and he looked dapper and all of that. So anyway, so Grandma married him, and they had 3 kids. My mother was the third. But it was not a happy marriage. Now, of course, 100 years later, I don't know all the details, but what I do know is that Grandma did commit adultery, because that was in the newspapers, believe it or not, back then. And it was a one-off thing, and the relationship didn't go anywhere from that. But it meant that when he could file for divorce, she was not allowed to have the children. Of course, she was an adulterer, and even though she wasn't continuing in that relationship, she did not intend to, be separated from the children, which caused her a lot of grief, I now know. But my mother and her siblings were placed in a children's home in Sydney, so they grew up in a children's home. My mother had no memory of her mother, because her mother had left when Mum was 2, and Mum couldn't remember her at all. And but we only found out later that Grandma had kept a flat home. She tried to contact her children at the orphanage. They wouldn't let her have contact because the court order did not allow her to have any contact at all with the children. And so it was nothing. So my mother grew up being told that she hated the children, didn't want to have anything to do with them. And she, the kids had to just forget about her because she was bad. And then when my mother was working when she was 22 in Sydney, she was working in a tax tax office, doing tax file returns. And she knew her mother's name. She didn't have a clue what she looked like or her age, and she had inherited one small thing from her mother, a birthday book. And in that birthday book was written her own birthday, the birthdays of her siblings, and it had a mother's birthday. And I think a father's birthday. I should know because I've got it. So she got this tax return with her mother's name on it. And so she decided to write to her and say, "Are you my mother?" And she tore out a page from the birthday book containing her own birthday. And it was her mother. So that was a 20-year gap. And then, of course, Mum's siblings were not sure about whether to meet this mother or not, that they were so bad. And anyway, in the end they did. And I grew up knowing my grandmother, my only grandparent. I knew my grandmother. And I love my grandmother. I knew the story of, well, I didn't know all the details, but I knew enough that I did know the story about how this all happened. And so it wasn't quite a normal relationship, but still my mother now had a mother, sort of had a mother, but hadn't had her growing up. And anyway, back in... So when I became a Christian when I was 11, which is in a few weeks' time will be 60 years ago, which made a dramatic and total difference to my life. But anyways, so I started praying every day for my grandmother's salvation, which I did for about 21 years, something like that. And then my mother rang me from Sydney to say, "Grandma's dying and she's not responding anymore to anything we say. You can't have a conversation with her." And so I got off the phone. I got down on my knees in Kingston and I said, "God, I've been praying for her for 20 years. I don't want to have to keep praying for her. I want an answer, I want it now. This is it. This is my final prayer for Grandma. She's dying and you can't talk to her anymore." And so I prayed this prayer that this is it. You better be listening, God. This is, I'm saying this and I want her saved. And send someone to her to speak of, the way of salvation, because she'd totally resisted any talk about God or anything like that before. And so then I felt really happy when I got up from that prayer. I was actually dancing around the kitchen. Nobody could see me except perhaps my little kids that were there. And, I was really excited because I really felt like God had answered that prayer. And then the phone rang again. My mother said, "I'm paying for you to come and see Grandma tomorrow." And that meant bringing the two youngest kids. I thought, I would have liked God to send someone else to see Grandma. You've got to be careful what you pray. And so then I did go to see her the next day. And she was lying down in bed in the hospital. And I went in to see her, and as soon as I got there, she immediately sat upright and was perfectly normal, talking. And I told her I needed to share something with her, and I had asked her what to share, and God said to declare to her forgiveness. Now I thought, that's what God said to share, so that's what I got to say. So I did, tell her that how that was and everything, and but in a simple form. She's a very, very intelligent woman, actually, and she was just immediately embraced it, whereas she would never have listened to anything about that before. Immediately embraced it, and I know that made a huge difference to her. It was the right time, and it was God's word to say, and. So it's just looking, now this is a picture of Grandma with my daughter Beth, just suddenly realising all those years when Grandma wondered whether she would ever see her children again, and here she is with her great-granddaughter, and she lived to see all 4 of them, although she died when the youngest one was quite small. The next one, which is yeah. If we just look back at this, how did Jesus deal with all these difficulties? As I said, he didn't look around. He wouldn't walk around burdened by the fact that he was surrounded by sinners or sickness or demons or people, with stupid ideas. He wasn't burdened by any of that. He just got on with it. But he healed compassionately the sickness, but by different methods. He didn't do the same thing all the time. Demons, he delivered people from them quickly. He wasn't on the lookout for demons. They came to him. They found him. Wrong thinking, he taught the truth with wisdom. He fitted the person, whether he was gentle or whether he was strong. Sin, he forgave, but he also sometimes challenged people. And he only commented about some sin. Just think of the amount of sin that he could have talked about. In any of us, any of his people. And the last statement, in all of his ministry, he was under the directions of his Father. I think that's where he got his rest from, because he wasn't obsessed about any of these categories. He wasn't looking for any of them. He was simply under the direction of his Father. And I love the verses, which I don't have time to read, in Mark 1:35, thereabouts, where Jesus is off praying, and he's just had a great day of healing and all that sort of stuff. And then the disciples come looking for him in the morning. Come on, Jesus, wake up. We want you because there's all these people queuing up ready for you to heal them. And Jesus calmly steps up and he says, well, today we're going to these other villages. Well, where did he get that from? He'd just been praying. God had just said, well, today, no, I don't want you hanging around just because these people are queuing up. I'm directing you. I'm sending you where you go. It's impossible for him to do everything, but he did what his Father told him to do in order to bring that abundant life and see people in God's kingdom. And I think I've gone over time. Okay, that's it. So, thank you.